Welcome to the Chassidic Approach to Joy, Chapter 11. We're talking about Simcha. Simcha is the rejoicing, the dynamic of empowerment, and we're going to talk about that. It happens to be that today's Tanya lesson, which we oftentimes refer to as the anger management class, is referencing that if you're in the middle of your prayers and some nudnik is coming up and harassing you and disturbing you when you're davening, when you're praying, that you need to know that that's from God. That's a message from God that you need to focus and concentrate more on your prayer. Yeah. So there are those who oppose the Chassidic movement who are appalled with this idea, because they're saying, how can you say that God is invested, that God is invested in the negative powers that are coming to disturb a Jew in his prayers? Well, because everything comes from God. And if we begin to understand that nothing is outside of God, nothing comes from outside of God, everything is from God. Therefore, even the bad, even the negative, even the evil, that itself also has to come from God. We then question why. Why should there be such a thing? And the Alter Rebbe goes into depth to explain the idea that for us to have free choice, there has to be evil that appears to have an equal power to it, at least in appearance. And so therefore, I remember in my days coming into yeshiva back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot in America. There was a lot of popular cults going on at that time. And I remember one of my concerns as I became more and more involved with Chabad Lubavitch was, how is this different from a cult? And when I came to understand and study the idea that there has to be, if there is something on the side of holiness, there has to be an equivalent, or at least an appearance of equivalency, in the side of evil, because otherwise you don't have a choice. To have a real choice means to have two things that are in appearance at least equal, and then you have to choose between them. There's no free choice between here's a $50 bill and here's a $1 bill, right? That just takes intelligence. The free choice is when you have what appears to be equal. So the evil has to have that equality. So the challenge that we have that people are facing today is when we look at things that appear to have righteous thoughts behind them, but then to dig deeper and say, well, is this really coming from a pure place? Is this really coming from a holy place? Or is this actually coming from an evil side? And then be able to choose between those two. And that's why you have people today who are mistakenly supporting what they think are human rights, when in reality, it's a very different picture. But they have to dig deeper into it, and that's where that challenge comes up, is we have to be able to see what's really going on. The Talmud talks about he who will be kind to the cruel ends up being cruel to the kind. So too much kindness is counterproductive. We're trying to be kind, we're trying to be good. But too much of that, especially in the wrong places, is actually counterproductive. And we go back to the example, the strongest example, which is right after the Jewish people left Egypt, Amalek attacked.
Yeah.
Amalek attacked. The decree from God was you have to wipe out Amalek, men, women, children, cattle, everything.
And we didn't.
Literally wipe them off the map. And how can we do that? Just the mere thought of genocide is horrific and horrendous, and it can't even be a Jewish idea. It's horrific, right? But because we didn't do that, now you have Haman, and then you have Hitler. It doesn't end. Evil has to be cut off at the root, and it has to be cut off completely, right?
Then there's no choice.
So, but we see people do make a choice. People do make the choice because they're being fooled by thinking they're being kind when that kindness is misplaced. That's the biggest challenge now. So I want to bring this back. This was today's the Tanya learning, but I want to bring it back to chapter 11 because chapter 11 is going to swing completely differently here, right? So we're talking about the Chassidic approach to joy. And simcha is unbounded joy. Simcha is the actual expression of unbounded joy. And we know that this joy is just as essential as love of God and fear of God, because joy is the expression of actually having true love and fear of God. It's the expression thereof. Maimonides says that there's no greatness or honor greater than the rejoicing, the celebration of God. The simcha, the joy of serving God, there's no greater honor. So yes, there's love of God and there's fear of God, but the greatest expression is the joy in the service of God. And for the example of in Jewish law, because Maimonides just talked about Jewish law, right? So the example of that we see in law is the fact that when we talk about prophets have to be very religious, they have to be very devout, they have to be very educated, but they have to be joyful. Prophecy never comes when someone is depressed or sad. The capacity for prophecy comes amidst joy. And we see the example of we're talking about serving God. So the Temple Mount, the idea of serving God on the Temple Mount was the bringing the sacrifices in the service of God. What was accompanied the sacrifices? The tribe of Levi would be singing, and there would be instruments playing, and it was joy. It was a joyous expression of the opportunity to be able to serve God, to be a part of God's world, right? And so also we talk about the menucha of Shabbos, the comfort of Shabbos, the rest that comes with Shabbos, being, blacking out the rest of the world to be totally connected with God on a Shabbos day. That also brings Simchas Shabbos, the joy of Shabbos itself. Now, there was a beautiful story in the chapter. We're going to go with the assumption that everyone read the chapter. That's a big assumption, right? But there's a beautiful story there about someone who was fulfilling the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuin, of redeeming the captive. Jews had been thrown into jail because they couldn't pay their rent, and suffering in that way, and which I don't ever understand, because how are you going to pay the rent if you're thrown in jail? There was no chance of getting the money back, right? But anyway, it's a different story. And someone trying to raise the money to do that. Now, there's only so much money you can gather from a poor community. But the depth of the mitzvah, the opportunity to serve God and to help a fellow Jew, pushed the person to do extraordinary things. In this case, it was going to the beer hall where the card games are going on, and from going from table to table and trying to collect from the constituents that are in the beer hall. And actually, it wasn't beer; it was vodka, Zexaneintica, 96 proof, right? And actually being challenged to take shots and being paid for taking the shots. And of course, by that time, he's totally plastered. And he even has to ask them to drop him off at the landlord's house so we can actually pay off the debt. And he pays off the debt, and then then someone's got to take him to shul because it's time for Yom Kippur for the services, and they open up the ark for the beginning services, the Kol Nidre, and he starts singing Simchas Torah songs because the ark is open, the Torah scrolls are coming out, and he's singing Torah songs, and the people try to shush him down, but he's so plastered, he is celebrated, right? And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, the rabbi, who of course has an insight into what's actually going on over there, says he's already there. We have to go through the stages of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot before we can reach Simchas Torah. He's already there. He's already gone there because of his giving literally Mesiras Nefesh, giving up his life, giving up, himself to help another Jew, that mitzvah connected him with God in such a way that he's already skipped over all that which you were trying to accomplish in Yom Kippur, and he's already holding by Simchas Torah. So, what do we see there? The height of our Tishrei, the height of our whole month of high holidays. What's the conclusion of that? Unbounded joy. Unbounded joy. Where we sing and dance with the Torah is still in its mantle. It's not opened up. It's not read. It's not about reading Torah. It's not about who can learn Torah and who can't learn Torah. Every Jew has an inheritance of the Torah, and every Jew has that right to dance with it and be a part of it. And that joy of that unity with God overcomes any boundaries. Now, I had the beauty, again, another year to spend Sukkot with my son in Fargo, North Dakota. And there's a handful of people that come for the services. No minyan. But somehow the joy continues for hours. And we sang and danced for hours and hours and hours for Simchas Torah. And that power, that energy can only come from an infinite source, from the connection with the infinite, and knowing that we have that connection. So we see that Simcha, by definition, is powerful, and the connection with God brings out that power, and therefore, it empowers us beyond self. There are some mitzvahs that we do, many mitzvahs that we do, that yes, it's selfless, but there's still a self involved. We give tzedakah. We love to give tzedakah. We are one of the most generous people, and we enjoy giving tzedakah, right? We enjoy giving tzedakah. There's still, in Yiddish we say ich. There's the I. There's the I that's involved. There's still the me that's enjoying giving tzedakah. So I'm still invested. I'm still a part of it, right? The question is to be able to get past ich to just God, just the mitzvah, and actually lose ourselves within the mitzvah. Now, I do know a guy, should rest in peace, but I remember a guy from years ago in Long Beach, California, who, God bless him, he lost himself in tzedakah. He literally lost himself in tzedakah to the degree that the rabbi said he needs to have a financial advisor who has to have control of his money and make sure that the family is also provided for, because he just kept giving and giving and giving. So for him, yes, he got lost in the midst of tzedakah. He actually did it beyond self totally. But so the idea then is to get beyond ourselves, right? To be lost in the mitzvah, to be lost in the joy of the mitzvah, to the experience where we're touching the infinite. And when we touch the infinite, that's where the real joy, that's where the real simcha comes, right? So as long as we're still involved, as long as the person is still engaged in it, in a sense, it's still about myself, then I haven't surpassed that. It's getting past oneself. I still like to think of and I've told this story before, but I just envision this. It's a beautiful story, but two brothers who were in Russia, in Soviet Russia, who ended up in prison for Jewish activity. And one of them started bemoaning that they were in a prison cell with a bunch of other people with a chamber pot. And because there's a chamber pot there, they couldn't do their prayers. They can't pray and they can't learn Torah with a chamber pot there. And he was bemoaning that when his brother said, what are you crying about? What are you upset about? He said, we can't daven and we can't learn Torah because there's a chamber pot here. And his brother said, fool, the same God that says we should pray and we should learn Torah said don't pray and don't learn Torah when there's a chamber pot. You're still doing God's will. You're fulfilling God's will by not learning when there's a chamber pot. Losing ourselves within what is the will of God, what does he want from us to do, and how we should do it, And of course, then the other brother said, "Whoa, that's so right, that's so correct." They started dancing. The two of them were dancing around and dancing around. And the other people in the cell, the Russians in the cell were like, "These guys are nuts." The guard comes to find out what's the commotion. And he said, "What is going on?" And the Russians say, "I don't know what they're saying, but these Jews are crazy. They're pointing at a chamber pot and they're singing and dancing." And the guard says, "Well, that's it. We're taking that out of the room." But the idea is to be lost in service. Now, everybody in the room here are people I know, and I know that you've all been in service in one way or another, volunteer service, actual service, and I know that every one of you has in a sense, let go of your own needs, put those aside for the active service that you do. And I want you to think back on, what did that feel like? What does that feel like when you're actually in service to something bigger than self, in service to God or to the community, or to the country, and that good feeling that comes from being able to actually provide real service. Not like the scout who was late to his scouting meeting, and the scoutmaster said, "Why are you late?" He said, "I was helping an old lady across the street." "Half an hour?" He said, "Yeah, but she didn't want to go." But to know that you're being useful, to know that you're being of service, that feeling is a deep joy that comes deeper than just doing something for ourselves. And so the idea here is to touch base with that infinite part of us, the deep soulless part of us, and coming from that, the soul aspect of ourselves, with that part within us, that part is infinite. And so the joy can be infinite. And that's when we talk about Simcha parts together, that joy breaks through all boundaries. I have been spending the last couple of days making some phone calls, specifically to folks that I know that might be affected by what's going on in Israel, either because, I know one guy that he served in the U.S. Marine Corps, but he also served in the IDF, and he's having a really tough time of it. We spent some time on the phone together talking about that and things like that, but also talking with some of my cadets that are on college campuses now, and the experiences they're going through, and walking through those things. And again, that simcha comes from touching deep within our core of that Jewish connection of what's really important for us, and then being able to tap into the infinite and bring out the joy of the service, the deep joy of the service. And so if we think about the simcha that we get in knowing the good things that we're doing, and knowing the service that we're providing, and knowing the connections that we're making with Amcha Yisrael, the entire Jewish people, and with God himself, that gives us reserve powers we never thought of. I know we've talked about this in a different class, but how many of you guys have ever thought of, have ever heard of laughter therapy? Yeah. So again, I was speaking with a veteran in Illinois today who's now in assisted living, and we were talking about there's a laughter therapy class, and it's just getting together and laughing, and you can come in stubborn and down and depressed, and after belly laughing for 5-10 minutes, you can't help but raise the spirit and be joyful, and so that that's even medically proven that joy and happiness can change the nature of things and bring those out. So that's the idea that we're talking about. This chapter, we've been talking about the Chassidic approach to joy, and being able to understand that there's a God. Nothing happens outside of God, and everything God does is for the good. When we can touch base with that inner aspect of our godly soul and connect with that in service to God and his mitzvahs, and his directive to us to create a dir b'tachtonim, a dwelling place for God in the world, to make the world a better place. When we lose ourselves in that mission, it brings a tremendous amount of joy, and that joy gives us further energy and power to be able to serve. And so it's a beautiful thing. It's a very powerful thing, and that's why going back to the very beginning of our book when we first started talking, we said that before the Chassidic movement even had a name of the Chassidim, the pious ones, they had a nickname called the Freiliche, the happy ones, because they're constantly happy. What do you have to be constantly happy about? Well, if you understand that God's involved in everything, and therefore everything is perfect, and therefore everything is good, so what's not to be joyous about? And bringing that joy, there's a lot of Chassidim are very active in supporting the IDF and bringing that joy to soldiers in active duty, because again, it empowers them in a very powerful, strengthening way to have joy come on base. And I can remember years ago, during a previous war in Israel, that when Chabad was going on base, I remember seeing some videos of entire platoons of Israelis singing and dancing and saying L'chaim with Lubavitchers that came on base. So, Chabad comes on base, okay, now it's time to sing and dance. And it lifts up the spirits and then go back to work, right? But that's the power of joy. That's the power of joy that comes from an infinite source, and that infinite source is that deep soul within us. So, L'chaim. Thoughts on tonight's class, particularly the topic as opposed to in chapter 11.
There should be more stush in the world, but in the right direction.
Stush Kedusha. Stush to Kedusha.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that for a second. So the idea of a shtus, a nonsense, a folly, a stupidity, a ridiculousness, right? So this world has become so dark and so full of craziness, right? So the idea of the Lubavitcher Rebbe was the world is surrounded with craziness in a way it's never been before. We have to respond in kind. We have to be crazy in kind, but crazy for a holy way, for a holy direction, right? So in world history, you didn't have people going out in the streets asking, "Are you Jewish? Would you like to put on tefillin?" I mean, that's nuts, right? But that's what we need to do in the world today to respond to the crazy craziness of the sick world. We have to respond by bringing sanctity and holiness into craziness as well. And so, to take Simchas Torah in Fargo, North Dakota, throughout Sukkot, right? Throughout Sukkot, we were dancing in the streets. We danced in the sukkah, we danced in the shul, we literally danced out in the streets. We did get off as the cars came by, but we were dancing in the streets because the idea is to take the joy out into the streets, to light up the streets with the joy. So, yeah, absolutely. Bring the joy out and light up the world with it.
Well, I was kind of thinking back. You remember a while back before you moved, we had the boys come in from out of town and went to the Museum of Science and Industry, saw the submarine, walking around through the museum, all the people coming back and forth, and every time some people, men would come by and say, "Are you Jewish? Are you Jewish?" And some guys would go, What? What's wrong with these guys? What are you going to do to us? At first, I was a little bit put off by it when I said, "Oh, it's great. What a mission from God." See him.
Exactly, mission from God. So this is the story back on that one. There were some boys from an alternative boys high school, Jewish high school, that came to Chicago. They were touring through. They came through and they were touring Chicago. They stayed at our house, and Bernie being a Navy guy, so we took the boys to the Museum of Science and Industry, where there's the U-505 exhibit of the captured Nazi sub, and we took them for a tour down the museum and took them through the sub and everything else. But the boys brought with them tefillin, asking everybody in the museum as we came across, "Are you Jewish? You want to put on?"
Absolutely. I was worried maybe the security. Nobody said anything though. Actually, so we were okay.
Right, but that's the idea of bringing sanctity into the craziness of this world.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That was a moment. Loved it.